You aren't always brought to the wilderness to be punished. Sometimes you're there with time on your hands so that you can see the glaring errors of those in leadership. Welcome to The Warrior Bride. I'm Autumn Woods, and we're looking at more spiritual wilderness survival tips from the story of David. For anyone who is just joining us, a wilderness season is one that involves trial, training, pruning, purging, and replacing old destructive habits with new godly ones. It's a combination of a time out that feels like forever and the most active boot camp you'll ever participate in. It's meant to fortify your relationship with God and strengthen you in your godly identity as you move on to the next level of your assignment. As I mentioned in the previous video, David's story is unique because before he is crowned king, he spends a good portion of his early life training in multiple wilderness stages and environments, all the while holding on to God's promises and believing that there would be an end to the suffering because God is faithful to keep his word. Given the monumental tasks David would perform, it makes sense that the training montage of Israel's once and future king would last a little bit longer than most. It's impossible to cram everything he learned into one video, so I'm going to hit 3 of the ways David survived his pre-kingdom wilderness boot camp. Before he became king of Israel, David was king of the sheep. When we first meet him, David is the Cinderella of his house, the youngest brother stuck out in the field babysitting his father's flocks. David is so looked down on by his family that at first he doesn't even get invited to meet the prophet Samuel when he comes to their house to anoint the next king. Even though his family underestimates him, David fulfills his duties faithfully. He guards his father's sheep from lions and bears, fighting them off and subduing them with his bare hands. When he is invited to the palace after being anointed king, he doesn't try to push King Saul off his throne prematurely, but ministers to the tormented monarch with music and song, engaging in spiritual warfare as an intercessor on Saul's behalf. Even in lowly positions, David practices being a servant, which prepares him for leadership. He does everything to the best of his ability and then some, winning favor with people everywhere he goes. Is everyone a David fan? Well, no. But he doesn't let that stop him from fulfilling the purposes God gave him. In fact, in his earliest exploits, he's able to drown out the naysayers so well because his ears are too full of God's voice to let anyone sway him. David is also wise enough to know that he shouldn't try to operate outside of the way God trained him. He can't go out to fight Goliath in Saul's armor. Not only does the mantle of kingship not yet belong to him, David hasn't tested the armor. Doing things someone else's way based on their understanding changes the way you move, makes you uncertain, and pulls your focus from God's infinite abilities onto your limited ones as you try to cope with new restrictions. This is especially detrimental if you're a pioneer and you've been called to partner with God in doing something that's never been done before. Don't worry about doing things anyway, but the way you learned between you and God. He'll correct you if you need adjustments. A need to develop intimacy with God is one of the biggest reasons people wind up in the wilderness. God wants to be deeply connected to you, and He will put everything in your life on hold so that you will want to seek Him out. It's not out of meanness, although it might seem otherwise. It's out of love. God wants you to get into the habit of coming to Him first because He has the best solutions. I didn't say the safest or the most fun. I said the best. He works everything out for the good of those who love Him, even the terrible things. He hopes you run to Him freely with your good, your bad, and your ugly, and He wants to share Himself with you. When deep friendship with God is formed, your life changes dramatically. I'm not trying to make God small here. No one can tame Him. He's wild and ferocious, and yet He loves us with an everlasting love. The Lord roars from Zion and utters His voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth quake. But the Lord is a refuge to His people, a stronghold to the people of Israel. There is a tenderness about him that draws us near and fascinates us in the light of his all-powerful nature. There is something beautiful and empowering about knowing that this being who created the universe and could wipe it all out in a fit of fury if he chose to, chooses to cherish us and care about the little things in our lives. And that knowledge can give you the courage to face down the world, because ultimately, the one who loves you best has overcome the world. Let's read part of Psalm 139 to get a better idea of what I'm talking about. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You have hedged me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even here shall your hand lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed. And in your book they all were written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God! How great is the sum of them! If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. Can you hear the awe and wonder and love in David's voice as he writes this? And how would he know all these things about the Lord and himself if they weren't having quality time together? David was an expert at drawing near to God, no matter how he was feeling or what he was going through. Psalms is a giant diary of the highs and lows of being a fallible person in relationship with a perfect God. Many of these songs were composed in wilderness seasons, periods of isolation, heartache, stress, sadness, and fury. But the overarching theme is that no matter how stormy David's life got, God was always faithful, and he is faithful today. He rescues those who love him because they acknowledge his name. David developed trust in God and used his time in isolation to commune with Yahweh and learn to respond to his voice like sheep follow their shepherd. This precious relationship dynamic is the source of godly confidence. You aren't always brought to the wilderness to be punished. Sometimes you're there with time on your hands so that you can see the glaring errors of those in leadership. You're meant to humbly learn that anybody can abuse their power to fulfill their own desires, and that it's by surrendering those desires in yourself to God that you can prevent those same mistakes from destroying you and those you're meant to protect. After David defeated Goliath and graduated from his first level of wilderness training, he faced an even more destructive foe than the Philistine giant, the spirit of jealousy. Up until they returned from battle, David had favor with Saul. He was the spiritual warrior whose music forced the distressing spirit from God to flee from the king. But when they marched home literal warriors in the victory parade, and the women grabbed their tambourines and started singing, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s," all hell broke loose. And Saul was furious and resented this song. "They have ascribed tens of thousands to David," he said, "but only thousands to me. What more can he have but the kingdom?" And from that day forward, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Like a wicked stepmother, or the devil himself, Saul daily sought ways to take David out and stop him from stealing the throne. But David had no intention of taking the kingship until God made the way.
Saul, you are no longer God's anointed king. Just as you have torn this garment from me, so your kingdom will be torn from you, and it will be given to another who is more worthy.
Even though God's spirit had departed from Saul, he was still the Lord's anointed, and not to be harmed by anyone, even the next king. Blinded by jealousy, Saul projected thoughts on David that were totally out of character and made an enemy out of one of his dearest friends. Instead of becoming David's mentor, Saul abdicated that position and instead proved himself a villain. The day after the song incident, Saul hurled spears at David and then sent him out on dangerous campaigns designed to kill him. Later, he made David his son-in-law and then annulled the marriage via a death warrant, and finally drove David to the literal wilderness, where Saul proceeded to hunt him like an outlaw. Saul murdered anyone who stood between him and David and tore his kingdom apart in an effort to stop what God put in motion. As horrible as all of this is, it taught David what can happen when you depart from God's will and protective covering. David made his share of mistakes too, but there was a big difference in his heart posture. Saul was unrepentant toward God. David fell on his face before God when conviction hit, and the Lord rewarded him for his faithfulness. In Psalm 51, after Nathan rebukes him for committing murder and adultery, David prostrates himself before God and says, "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only, have I sinned, and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak, and blameless when you judge. Against you and you only have I sinned, Lord." That's a big difference from Saul's response to Samuel's correction a few chapters ago. "I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now, therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me, that I may worship the Lord." Notice how many times what other people think of Saul shows up in that apology. He won't even humble himself, but wants Samuel to make it look like everything's okay. He's more concerned with appearances than with his heart, and we know which one God values more. Even though David sinned too, his heart broke that he became prideful enough to sin against God because of the foundation of their relationship. "I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words" shows the distance between Saul's heart and God's. David learned from Saul's unfortunate example, and God honored him. For David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and had not turned aside from anything the Lord commanded all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Part of that honor included Jesus Christ being born into David's family line. In the next video, we'll cover 2 more wilderness survival tips from David's next level of wilderness boot camp. If you're finding value in this content, don't forget to like, sub, share, and hit the bell. New episodes drop Saturdays at 9 a.m. See you soon.